Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to look into something we all kind of do, but don't often actually think about. Like all the little things, everyday tasks. But we're going to look at the gender lines in those tasks.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're going to look at the work of psychologist Ursula Athenstaedt. She's got these scales, the behavioral masculinity and the behavioral femininity scales.
Right.
And they offer a fascinating look at which everyday tasks we kind of, as a society, still lean towards seeing as either more male or female.
Right.
And what's really cool about this is that her research uses these effect sizes to show just how strong those associations are.
Exactly.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something we all kind of experience, but we don't really stop to think about much.
Right.
And that's all those sort of unspoken gender lines, those gender lines in our daily routines.
Yeah.
Like what we see as a man's job or woman's job.
Mm-hmm.
So to really get into this, we're going to be exploring the work of the psychologist Ursula Athenstaedt. She has these fascinating scales called behavioral masculinity and behavioral femininity. And basically what these scales do is they offer a way to look at which everyday tasks our society, still leans towards seeing as more male or female,
Exactly. And it's really interesting because her research goes beyond just saying, oh, yeah, this task is associated with this gender and actually uses effect sizes.
Oh, wow.
So you can actually see how strong these associations can be.
That's really neat. So it's not just anecdotal. It's no, this is really strong. There's a strong association here.
Right, yeah. And, along with Athenstaedt's work, you've provided us with some really interesting materials, like a really rich set of things to delve into.
Yeah.
So I think our goal today should be to really dig into this. How deep do these perceptions go?
Yeah.
Where did they come from?
Mm-hmm.
Are they changing at all?
And what do they really tell us? Right.
Yeah. What do they tell us about how we see ourselves and how we see each other?
Yeah.
In our everyday lives.
Totally. And it's, while Athenstaedt's study, it focuses on, a Western European context, the patterns that she's found, they really echo in a much broader global conversation.
Yeah.
It's really relevant to a lot of people. But before we go too much further, I think it's key to sort of say right off the bat, we are not talking about who can or cannot do what.
Right.
This isn't about limitations. It's about societal perceptions of these tasks.
Yes.
It's those links we make often unconsciously between certain tasks and certain genders.
Absolutely.
Okay. So to get started, where do we even start?
Well, to understand Athenstaedt's work, I think it's helpful to think about gender role theory.
Okay.
Right. The basic idea here is that the way we understand what it means to be a man or a woman, it's at least partly constructed through doing things, through the repeated performance of everyday actions.
Oh, interesting.
So you might remember Sandra Bem's work with the sex role inventory that looked at personality traits traditionally associated with each gender.
Right. So assertiveness or nurturing, things like that.
Exactly, yeah. But what Athenstaedt did was she shifted the focus to tangible behaviors like actions.
Okay.
Instead of asking about, let's say, assertiveness, she looked at, for example, the act of assembling furniture.
Oh, interesting.
And her research it gets on to quantify how strongly those specific actions are actually linked to the way we think about masculinity or femininity.
Oh, that's really interesting. So shifting it from like inherent characteristics, like you're saying, to actual learned behaviors.
Yeah.
That's a really useful distinction, I think.
Right.
And it makes me think immediately about like how much context matters, right?
Yes.
Like grilling in so many Western settings, it feels like, a very masculine activity.
Right.
But then if you look, cross-culturally,
Yes.
even just within different families, it might just be whoever enjoys cooking,
Exactly. Yeah.
Or think about like men as primary caregivers.
Yeah.
The historical variations in that role are huge.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that cultural and historical fluidity is really important to remember. Athenstaedt's research it's like a detailed snapshot.
Right.
It's taken in a particular time and place, and it shows us what's happening in that time and place. It reveals those cultural like currents that are at play. But the thing that really stood out to me was the strength of the effect sizes.
Oh, wow.
She calculated these effect sizes, and they really highlight how deeply some of these associations are just ingrained in us.
Wow. So they're not just like weak associations. They're pretty strong.
No, they're pretty ingrained.
Okay, so let's get specific then, right?
Yeah.
What kinds of behaviors did her research actually show as having that strong association with masculinity?
Okay, so let's see, looking at the data, one category that really pops out is technical or manual labor.
Okay.
Things like changing the fuses in the house, general repair work, tinkering with the car, and interestingly enough, assembling furniture.
Yeah.
All of these showed like a significant link to masculine perceptions. Actually, the effect size for assembling furniture was like surprisingly large.
Really? Oh.
Which suggests it's not just about being able to lift heavy objects or something. It's a really culturally ingrained link.
Huh. Assembling furniture, even more so than just general repairs.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I wonder if it's something about the idea of like building things,
It's a great point.
Constructing things, like a traditionally masculine, activity maybe.
It could be, yeah. Another really strong category was outdoor and physical tasks.
Okay, yeah.
Things like mowing the lawn, shoveling snow.
Yeah.
Those were very clearly associated with masculinity.
Yeah.
But also things like riding a motorcycle or participating in extreme sports.
Right.
All those activities that have connotations of risk-taking, physical prowess.
Yeah.
These are very often linked to the idea of being male.
It's interesting, like even the motorcycle riding, it's almost like it taps into this idea of freedom, maybe a little bit of rebellion too, right?
Yes.
Which again are very traditionally coded as more masculine, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And then finally, Athenstaedt's work showed financial or work-related items also had a strong association.
Okay.
So specifically, picking up the dinner bill in a social setting.
Yeah.
And working overtime.
Yeah.
Those were both behaviors that statistically, lean toward masculine perceptions.
Interesting.
The effect size for picking up the bill was really something.
Oh, wow.
It really speaks volumes about those traditional provider roles.
Yeah, the provider archetype, right?
Exactly.
Coming through loud and clear, like the man as the financial head. The one who's like taking care of expenses.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So that gives us a good sort of picture of the masculine side. What about the behaviors that her findings link to femininity?
Yeah. So on the other side of the scale, there's a strong association with caregiving and domestic tasks.
Okay.
So this would be things like babysitting, cooking meals, making jam.
Interesting.
Even the very specific act of sewing on a button and doing the ironing.
Right.
So these tasks, historically, culturally, they're tied to the domestic sphere.
Yeah.
And those nurturing roles.
Right.
Yeah.
That classic image of the nurturing caregiver,
Yeah.
the heart of the home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it aligns with a lot of traditional, narratives.
Absolutely. And additionally, there were aesthetic or artistic touches.
Okay.
These also had a strong association with femininity. So things like decorating with flowers, wrapping presents beautifully,
Yes.
all these tasks that involve, attention to detail, visual presentation.
Yeah.
They're often stereotypically associated with femininity.
It's striking, right? Like even something as neutral as like gift wrapping
Yeah.
can carry a gendered undertone in our societal perception.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
really highlights just how pervasive these norms can be.
Yeah.
Even in the smallest, the most subtle everyday actions, they can have an influence.
Wow.
And then finally, there were the communication and emotional support behaviors.
Okay.
These were also more strongly associated with femininity. So things like listening attentively when someone's talking,
Yeah.
discussing, personal problems openly, even the simple act of hugging a friend.
Right.
All of these fell into that category.
So the emphasis on like emotional labor and interpersonal connection,
Yeah.
which are very often attributed to women.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see these patterns emerge, in the data. Okay, so thinking about these masculine tasks, how have like traditional male viewpoints historically shaped the way we understand and even value these things?
Well, traditionally, a man's ability to carry out these tasks,
Yeah.
these masculine tasks, it's often been tied to his sense of self, right? His sense of identity, his perceived role as a provider, a protector.
Right.
So historically, being competent in technical skills,
Yeah.
physical labor,
Yeah.
or financial provision, that really reinforced these ideas of masculinity. And successfully doing these tasks, being able to do these things well, could bring a sense of pride, a sense of competence,
Right.
fulfillment even.
Yeah.
And it would align with cultural expectations, and it would
Yeah.
really contribute to a man's standing in society.
It's almost like these tasks became a way to like demonstrate masculinity, right?
Yeah.
To perform it in a way that's tangible.
Absolutely, yeah.
What about the other side? How have traditional, female perspectives shaped the feminine tasks?
Well, for women, engaging in those feminine tasks has historically been very closely tied to their roles as nurturers, caregivers, the maintainers of the home environment. And even with the increase in women working outside the home,
Right.
these expectations, they often persist.
Yeah.
Sometimes as internalized beliefs.
Right.
There can still be this societal expectation that women, they have the primary responsibility for the organization of the home, for the emotional well-being of the family.
Yeah.
And performing these tasks, it's seen as an expression of, care and love. It reinforces a traditional female identity.
Right.
And contributes to those perceived social roles.
It really does feel like even when women have, full-time careers outside the home, there's often still this underlying assumption that their primary role is still in that domestic sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. But, it's not like a completely static picture.
Right.
We are seeing some pretty big shifts, particularly with younger generations. They're really starting to question these traditional binaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's really encouraging, actually.
Yeah.
You see like young men who find genuine satisfaction in cooking.
Yeah.
And they don't see it as conflicting with their, sense of masculinity.
Right.
And then you see more and more young women getting into fields that were traditionally seen as, male,
Yeah.
like mechanics, technology, things like that.
Right.
We're also seeing more visibility for things like, men who enjoy knitting or women who are really passionate about motorcycles.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a really important observation. While Athenstaedt's, scales are capturing the overall patterns, these changes in attitude and behavior, they're likely affecting how strong those associations are, over time.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be surprising to see some of those effect sizes go down in future research.
Yeah.
As these norms keep changing.
Right. So it's almost like the map still shows these like color-coded areas, but the lines are becoming less distinct.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's dig into some of those more surprising, maybe even like contradictions that emerge when we look closer at these gendered associations.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so one thing that I think is really interesting is the increasing convergence in household tasks. We've seen this in a lot of Western countries. You know, if you look at surveys over the last few decades, they consistently show men taking on more responsibility for things like, laundry, washing dishes.
Right.
And, we're not at perfect equality yet.
Right.
But the trend is definitely there.
Yeah.
And I think it really reflects those changing attitudes that we were just talking about.
Right. It's a sign that the practical reality of household work is kind of catching up, to these more egalitarian views. What about those overlaps, those surprising overlaps that you mentioned earlier?
Right. Yeah. So these overlaps are really interesting, and they really highlight the problems with these strict gender classifications.
Okay.
So, for example, let's take assembling furniture.
Okay.
This is strongly associated with masculinity.
Right.
But anyone who's ever, tried to put together some flat pack furniture, they know it requires more than just tools. You need patience, problem solving skills.
Right.
And even like a bit of creativity. Right?
Yeah, for sure. You got to interpret the instructions.
Yes. Those instructions they're often pretty confusing.
Absolutely.
And on the flip side, let's take something like sewing on a button.
Okay.
Typically seen as feminine.
Yeah.
But that can involve technical knowledge of sewing machines, different stitch types, fabric properties.
Right.
So these overlaps, they show us that the skills required for a lot of these tasks, they're not inherently male or female.
Yeah.
Even if the tasks themselves have these gendered perceptions attached to them.
That's a really good point. It reminds you that the abilities and aptitudes are not confined by gender,
yeah.
even if societal expectations sometimes are.
Yeah.
You also mentioned occupational spillover.
Oh, right. Yes.
Can you elaborate on what that is?
Yeah. So this is when someone's profession, their job, is traditionally associated with a certain gender,
right?
And they end up carrying those tasks over into their personal life.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And it doesn't necessarily match their gender.
Right.
So, imagine a woman, she works as a mechanic.
Yeah.
She's probably more likely to handle, car repairs at home.
Right.
And it's not because she's a woman, it's because she's got the expertise.
Right. She's
developed that on the job.
Totally.
Same thing, if a man's a chef, he might naturally do more of the cooking at home.
Right.
It's those skills and that comfort level they've built up in one part of their life influencing another.
It makes sense, yeah. Like your professional life can almost create its own set of norms.
Yeah.
And those might override, some of the broader societal expectations.
Right, exactly.
And then of course there's, what we grew up seeing.
Yes.
The power of that, social reinforcement.
Absolutely. Research has consistently shown that, children pick up a lot about gender roles just from watching their parents, watching other adults in their life do things, perform various tasks.
Yeah.
And this early modeling, this really plays a part in shaping how they understand what's considered men's work versus women's work.
Yeah.
Like if a child always sees their dad doing, the yard work and their mom doing all the cooking, those associations, they get,
ingrained. Yeah.
They get really ingrained. And it shows how these societal norms are passed down, through the generations.
Yeah.
And it often happens without anyone, directly teaching it.
Right. It's like we're constantly absorbing these subtle cues from the environment from when we're really little.
Yeah.
And that shapes our, even our unconscious biases about these things.
Exactly.
So, I mean, if we try to dig a little deeper here, what are some of the foundational reasons why these gendered patterns exist in the first place?
Okay, so there are a few different interconnected factors at play.
Okay.
One major influence is the historical division of labor.
Okay.
If we go way back to agrarian societies, there was often a very clear separation of tasks.
Right.
It was based on physical demands and reproductive roles.
Yeah.
So men were typically doing, the heavier work, the outdoor labor.
Yeah.
and women were focused on, domestic tasks and childcare.
Right, right.
And over time, those practical divisions, they evolved into something more symbolic.
Right.
They became representations of masculinity and femininity.
Yeah.
And they kind of stuck around.
Right.
Even as society's industrialized and those initial, reasons for that division, they weren't really relevant anymore.
Yeah. So it's almost like roles that might have started out as just, being practical.
Yeah.
Became very deeply embedded in our like cultural understanding of what gender is.
Exactly. And then we also have the power of social conditioning, right?
Right.
And reinforcement.
Yeah.
As we've been talking about, children learn by watching, by imitating. If they consistently see one parent doing certain tasks, it just reinforces the idea that those tasks are for that gender.
Right.
And then you have societal expectations.
Yeah.
Even really subtle things like encouragement or discouragement,
Yeah.
those further solidify those roles.
Right.
Think about the toys that are marketed, to boys versus girls.
Oh, yeah.
That often subtly steers them toward
Totally different activities. Yeah.
different kinds of activities and skills. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a continuous feedback loop.
Totally. Yeah.
What we see becomes what we expect.
Right.
What we expect influences what we do and then what we teach the next generation.
Yeah. And we can't overlook the role of media in this whole thing either.
Oh, absolutely. Media representation, whether it's on TV, in advertising, in films, and increasingly on social media, it plays a big role in keeping those stereotypical portrayals going.
Yeah.
We still very often we see men in these roles that emphasize, action problem solving.
Yeah.
And then women are often, portrayed in those nurturing domestic settings.
Yeah.
And even if it's unintentional, seeing those images over and over again, it really reinforces the idea that certain tasks just naturally belong with a certain gender.
Right. It's almost like it creates like a mental shortcut.
Yes.
Reinforces existing biases without us even realizing it's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
You also mentioned structural realities, like the average differences in physical strength.
Right. How does that factor into these perceptions?
So it's important not to oversimplify things.
Yeah.
But average physiological differences, like upper body strength, for example, they can play a part in how we associate certain tasks with masculinity.
Okay.
Particularly those tasks that involve heavy lifting or a lot of physical labor.
Right. Yeah.
But it's really important to remember that those are just averages.
Yeah.
They don't define what individuals are capable of.
Right.
A lot of the tasks that are linked with masculinity, they don't even really require that much strength.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of people who don't fit those averages.
Yeah.
So the perception itself often carries more weight than the actual physical requirement.
Right. It's like the perceived norm can overshadow the reality.
Yes, exactly.
The individual, capabilities.
Yeah.
And then finally, you touched on the impact of these changing economic and social landscapes.
Right.
How does that play into all this?
So this is a big one. It's a major driver of change.
Okay.
With more and more women, working and even becoming primary breadwinners in many cases.
Yeah.
Those traditional divisions in the household, they're being renegotiated.
Right.
Out of necessity.
Right.
We're seeing, men taking on bigger roles in childcare.
Yeah.
In domestic tasks and the opposite too, more women are dealing with the finances or taking on those traditionally male home projects.
Yeah.
So those evolving, economic and social realities, they're actively changing those patterns that Athenstaedt's research is showing us.
Yeah.
And I think it's likely to continue.
So it sounds like we're in this constant state of evolution, where these patterns that were so ingrained, they're being challenged and redefined by just the realities of modern life.
Yes, exactly. So as we kind of wrap up this really interesting conversation, what would you say is the key takeaway from Ursula Athenstaedt's research and from, our deep dive here today?
I'd say the main takeaway is that Athenstaedt's scales, the behavioral masculinity and femininity scales, they give us a really valuable data-driven look at just how much those everyday tasks are still seen and often actually carried out along gender lines,
Yeah.
Even if some of those links seem kind of obvious,
Right.
when you see the actual data, especially those effect sizes, it really shows just how persistent and strong those societal connections are.
Right. It's a good reminder that even in, what we like to think of as more egalitarian times, these unconscious biases that we have, related to gender and these everyday things, they still have a hold on us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that these patterns, they're not set in stone. As we've discussed, they come from historical context, they come from cultural norms, from social influences.
Yeah.
And those are all things that can change over time.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like the trends, especially with the younger generations, they do suggest that we are seeing change, even if it's, gradual.
Yes, I think that's a really good point.
So I guess the value in understanding these patterns, it's not about reinforcing them. It's about bringing them into our awareness.
Exactly.
So that we can actively work towards, getting rid of those limiting stereotypes.
Right. Yeah. When we recognize where these perceptions come from, and how strong they are.
Yeah.
It gives us the power to challenge them.